The blood drained from Nancy Pelosi's face when Lauren Boebert placed those Swiss bank documents on the table. Those documents contained proof that the Pelosi family had stolen $23 million from Ukraine aid funds. Paul Pelosi Jr.'s secret deals with Ukrainian energy companies were about to completely destroy America's most powerful female politician. What happened in the next 90 seconds would expose the largest money laundering operation in congressional history and prove that the Pelosi family had been using American taxpayer money meant for Ukrainian civilians to enrich themselves through a web of shell companies and offshore accounts. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation that's about to shatter everything you thought you knew about Ukraine aid, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. You're about to witness the complete destruction of a political dynasty that thought they were untouchable. The packed House chamber buzzed with electric tension on this cold February morning, the kind of atmospheric pressure that builds before a Category 5 hurricane makes landfall. What was supposed to be a routine oversight hearing on Ukraine aid distribution was about to become the most devastating political exposure in congressional history. Sitting at the witness table, 37-year-old Congresswoman Lauren Boebert from Colorado had come armed with evidence that would destroy one of the most powerful political families in America. Her navy blue blazer was perfectly pressed, her demeanor calm and professional, but those who knew her recognized the look in her eyes. The same focused intensity of a prosecutor who had spent months building an airtight case against a criminal organization. Lauren Boebert had spent 14 months quietly investigating the flow of Ukraine aid money, working with international banking experts, forensic accountants, and whistleblowers from inside major financial institutions. What she had uncovered was a sophisticated money laundering operation that used humanitarian aid as cover for massive personal enrichment. Her team had traced wire transfers through 17 different countries, identified dozens of shell companies designed to hide stolen funds, and reconstructed financial transactions that painted a picture of systematic theft that reached the highest levels of Democratic Party leadership. They had bank records from Switzerland, Cyprus, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands showing exactly how American taxpayer money intended for Ukrainian refugees had been diverted into Pelosi family accounts. Across the chamber sat Nancy Pelosi, 84 years old and radiating the kind of arrogant confidence that comes from 5 decades of unchecked political power. Her signature purple blazer was tailored to perfection, her silver hair styled by Washington's most expensive salon, and her demeanor suggested a woman who believed herself completely above the law. Pelosi represented everything wrong with modern American politics. A career politician who had entered Congress as a middle-class housewife and somehow accumulated a personal fortune worth over $200 million while drawing a government salary. She controlled committee assignments, determined which bills reached the floor, and wielded more real power than most presidents ever dreamed of having. For decades, Pelosi had perfected the art of political survival, using her position to enrich her family while presenting herself to voters as a champion of working families and humanitarian causes. She'd survived scandals, weathered investigations, and emerged from every controversy stronger than before. She thought she was invincible. But today, all of that was about to come crashing down in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. This confrontation was the culmination of one of the most thorough financial investigations ever conducted by a sitting member of Congress. Lauren Boebert had begun noticing suspicious patterns in Ukraine aid distribution 14 months earlier, when routine oversight requests were being mysteriously delayed or denied by agencies that typically cooperated with congressional inquiries. Her staff had started asking questions about why certain contractors were receiving massive Ukraine aid contracts despite having no relevant experience or infrastructure in Eastern Europe. They noticed that many of these companies had been incorporated just weeks before receiving multi-million-dollar government contracts, and that their ownership structures were deliberately obscured through layers of shell companies. The breakthrough came when a whistleblower from Credit Suisse reached out to Boebert's office with evidence of suspicious wire transfers involving American aid money. This brave banker, whose identity would remain protected, provided access to confidential banking records that showed how humanitarian aid funds were being systematically diverted into private accounts controlled by American politicians and their families. What followed was a painstaking investigation that required cutting-edge forensic accounting techniques, international cooperation with banking authorities, and the kind of meticulous attention to detail that would make FBI financial crimes investigators proud. Boebert's team had to be absolutely certain that every piece of evidence was authentic, legally obtained, and completely irrefutable. They traced money through a labyrinth of offshore accounts in Switzerland, Cyprus, Luxembourg, Malta, and the British Virgin Islands. They identified shell companies with names like Eastern European Relief Services, LLC, Humanitarian Development Partners, and Ukraine Reconstruction Enterprises that existed solely to hide the flow of stolen aid money. Most importantly, they had recovered email communications between Pelosi family members and Ukrainian business partners that captured them in their own words planning the theft of American aid money and discussing specific amounts that would be stolen and laundered through their network of shell companies. The Ukraine aid program had been sold to the American people as a humanitarian mission to help Ukrainian civilians survive Russian aggression. Congress had appropriated over $200 billion in aid, with the understanding that this money would provide food, medical supplies, housing, and other essential services to war refugees and displaced families. But what Boebert had discovered was that significant portions of this aid money were being diverted before it ever reached Ukraine. Sophisticated money laundering operations were skimming millions of dollars from aid shipments, inflating contractor costs by enormous amounts, and creating fake humanitarian projects that existed only on paper. The Pelosi family's operation was the most sophisticated of all. Using Paul Pelosi Jr.'s connections in the energy industry, they had created a network of shell companies that appeared to be legitimate humanitarian contractors, but were actually vehicles for stealing aid money and funneling it into family accounts. Their scheme worked like this. Nancy Pelosi would use her position as Speaker to steer aid contracts to companies controlled by her son. These companies would invoice the government for humanitarian services at massively inflated prices, then provide minimal actual services while pocketing the difference. The stolen money would then be laundered through offshore accounts and eventually transferred to Pelosi family investments. The beauty of the scheme from their perspective was that it was almost impossible to detect through normal oversight procedures. The amounts involved were relatively small compared to the overall aid package. The shell companies appeared legitimate on paper, and any questions about specific contracts could be deflected by claiming that detailed disclosure would compromise operational security in a war zone. The Ukraine aid oversight hearing had been scheduled as part of Congress's routine oversight responsibilities. Pelosi had actually agreed to testify, confident that she could use the forum to defend the aid program while positioning herself as a champion of Ukrainian freedom and humanitarian values. She had no idea that Lauren Boebert had specifically requested to participate in this hearing because she knew it would provide the perfect opportunity to expose the Pelosi family's crimes in front of a national audience. While Pelosi prepared her usual talking points about American leadership and humanitarian responsibility, Boebert was preparing the most comprehensive presentation of financial crimes evidence ever assembled by a member of Congress. The chamber was packed with reporters, foreign policy experts, humanitarian advocates, and political observers who expected to witness routine political theater about aid effectiveness and oversight procedures. Major news networks had sent their top congressional correspondents, anticipating that the hearing might produce some newsworthy exchanges about America's role in supporting Ukraine. None of them were prepared for what they were about to witness: the complete and total destruction of one of the most powerful political families in America, captured live on television and broadcast to millions of viewers around the world. The hearing began with routine questions about aid distribution, contractor oversight, and humanitarian outcomes in Ukraine. Pelosi delivered her prepared responses with the smooth confidence of someone who had testified before Congress hundreds of times over her career. Her answers were polished, rehearsed, and designed to deflect any serious scrutiny while positioning her as a thoughtful leader protecting both American interests and Ukrainian civilians. Madam Speaker, Boebert began when her turn came to question, her voice carrying the authority of someone who knew exactly where this conversation was heading. You've been one of the strongest advocates for continued Ukraine aid in Congress. Can you tell us about your family's personal involvement in Ukraine aid distribution? Pelosi's response was classic political deflection, delivered with the practiced sincerity that had served her well for decades. Congresswoman, my family and I are proud to support the Ukrainian people in their fight for freedom and democracy. We believe America has a moral obligation to help innocent civilians who are suffering from Putin's illegal aggression. The answer sounded noble to casual observers, but Boebert wasn't interested in political theater. She had spent months preparing for this exact moment, and she knew that behind Pelosi's humanitarian rhetoric lay a criminal conspiracy that would shock the American people. She reached into her briefcase with deliberate precision, building suspense as she pulled out a thick folder marked with Swiss banking seals and international wire transfer documentation. The gesture seemed routine enough, but experienced political observers immediately recognized that something unprecedented was about to happen. Madam Speaker, Boebert said, her voice taking on a prosecutorial edge that made everyone in the chamber sit up and pay attention. I'd like to discuss some financial transactions that might shed light on your family's actual involvement in Ukraine aid distribution. I think the American people deserve to know the truth about where their tax dollars are really going. The large screens positioned throughout the House chamber flickered to life, displaying official Swiss banking documents that would make headlines around the world. The letterhead clearly showed Credit Suisse private banking, along with account numbers, transaction dates, and wire transfer amounts that immediately caught everyone's attention. These are official banking records from Credit Suisse in Geneva, Switzerland, Boebert announced, her voice carrying across the now silent chamber with the authority of a federal prosecutor presenting evidence to a grand jury. These documents were obtained through an international banking investigation conducted in cooperation with Swiss financial authorities. Pelosi's confident expression began to crack for the first time as she realized what she was looking at. Her face went pale, her hands gripped the witness table, and her voice took on a defensive tone that everyone in the room immediately noticed. Congresswoman, I have no idea what you think those documents show, but this appears to be a violation of banking privacy laws. Banking privacy laws, Madam Speaker? Boebert interrupted, her voice cutting through Pelosi's protest like a scalpel through tissue. These accounts were flagged by international anti-money laundering investigators for suspicious activity related to American government funds. There is no privacy protection for criminal activity, regardless of which country the money is hidden in. She clicked to the first transaction record, and the screen zoomed in to show a wire transfer that would end Pelosi's political career. This is a wire transfer dated March 15, 2023, in the amount of $2.3 million from Ukraine Humanitarian Relief Fund, LLC, to an account listed under Pelosi Family Holdings, Geneva. The memo line reads, consultant fees for Eastern European development projects. The chamber erupted in gasps and murmurs, but Boebert continued reading without missing a beat. The interesting thing about this transfer, Madam Speaker, is that Ukraine Humanitarian Relief Fund, LLC, received exactly $2.3 million from the U.S. Treasury Department on March 14, 2023, one day before it was transferred to your family's Swiss account. The money never reached Ukraine at all. Pelosi tried desperately to regain control, her voice cracking under pressure as she realized her carefully constructed financial empire was being exposed in real time. These transactions are being taken completely out of context. My family's business dealings have nothing to do with government aid programs. Nothing to do with aid programs. Boebert shot back, advancing to the next screen with devastating precision. Let's examine that claim, Madam Speaker. This is a wire transfer record from April 22, 2023, showing $3.7 million transferred from Eastern European Infrastructure Partners to your son Paul Pelosi Jr.'s account at UBS in Zurich. The screen displayed another damning transaction. Eastern European Infrastructure Partners received $3.7 million from the U.S. Agency for International Development on April 21, 2023 for emergency housing construction in Ukraine. But according to UN Refugee Agency records, no housing was ever constructed by this company, and no Ukrainian officials have ever heard of Eastern European infrastructure partners. The audience was in complete shock now, with reporters frantically typing and congressmen shouting over each other. But Boebert's voice cut through the chaos. The money meant to house Ukrainian refugees went directly into your son's Swiss bank account, where it was then invested in San Francisco real estate projects that benefited your family's investment portfolio. She clicked to the next screen, showing a complex financial flowchart. This pattern repeated dozens of times, Madam Speaker. Aid money would be allocated to shell companies controlled by your family. The companies would submit invoices for humanitarian services that were never provided, and the money would be immediately transferred to offshore accounts for your personal use. But the banking records were only the beginning of Boebert's presentation. She had also recovered email communications that would prove the theft was intentional and coordinated. Madam Speaker, we also obtained email communications between you and your son that show this wasn't accidental mismanagement. It was deliberate theft of humanitarian aid money. The screen displayed an email exchange that would end the Pelosi family's political dynasty. This email from you to Paul Pelosi Jr. is dated February 8, 2023, 2 weeks before the major Ukraine aid package was voted on. Let me read it for the committee. Paul, Ukraine aid vote scheduled for February 22nd. $50 billion package includes emergency contractor provisions with minimal oversight. Set up shell companies immediately. Our target is $25 million minimum. Use Geneva accounts for initial transfers. Gasps turned to shouts of outrage as Paul Pelosi Jr.'s response appeared on screen. Mom, companies incorporated in Delaware and Cyprus. Banking established in Switzerland and Luxembourg. Contractor applications will be submitted through different firms to avoid detection. Conservative estimate is $30 million possible extraction from aid funds. The systematic nature of the conspiracy was becoming clear to everyone in the chamber. This wasn't opportunistic corruption, Madam Speaker. This was premeditated theft of money intended to help war refugees. You used your position as Speaker to ensure that your family's fake companies would receive aid contracts. Then you stole the money while Ukrainian children went hungry. Boebert's investigation had uncovered an even deeper level of corruption involving Ukrainian energy companies and the Pelosi family's long-term business relationships. But the Ukraine aid theft was just the latest chapter in your family's decade-long corruption in Eastern Europe, Madam Speaker. These banking records show that Paul Pelosi Jr. has been receiving payments from Ukrainian energy companies since 2014. The screen displayed a series of transactions spanning nearly a decade. Here's a $1.2 million payment from Burisma Holdings in 2014, the same company that paid Hunter Biden. Here's $2.8 million from Ukrainian Natural Gas Enterprises in 2016. Here's $4.1 million from Eastern European Energy Partners in 2019. Every payment coincides with legislative actions you took that benefited these companies. She clicked through screen after screen of evidence. In 2014, you supported legislation that increased American energy aid to Ukraine by $500 million. Your son received $1.2 million from Burisma 3 days later. In 2016, you blocked sanctions on Ukrainian energy companies that were under investigation for corruption. Your son received $2.8 million from those same companies 1 week later. The pattern was unmistakable. You've been selling American foreign policy to Ukrainian energy companies for a decade, Madam Speaker. The recent aid theft was just your family expanding into stealing humanitarian money, while you continued selling legislative favors to your energy company partners. Boebert had saved the most damaging evidence for last recorded phone conversations that captured the Pelosi family planning their crimes. Madam Speaker, we also have recorded phone calls between you and your son discussing the theft of aid money. These recordings were obtained through a federal financial crimes investigation warrant. The first recording began playing, and Nancy Pelosi's own voice filled the chamber. Paul, the Ukraine aid package is larger than we expected, $200 billion total. Our opportunity for extraction is enormous. But we need to be more sophisticated about hiding the money flows. Paul Pelosi Jr.'s voice responded, "Mom, I've established relationships with Swiss bankers who specialize in political money laundering. They can move $50 million through shell companies without triggering international reporting requirements." Nancy Pelosi, perfect. The key is creating enough fake companies that each individual contract looks legitimate. We'll spread the theft across dozens of transactions so no single amount triggers oversight attention. The conversation continued with devastating detail. The beauty of using humanitarian aid is that nobody wants to interfere with helping war refugees. We can steal millions while claiming anyone who questions us is unpatriotic or pro-Putin. A second recording revealed the full scope of the family's criminal thinking. "Paul, we need to be prepared for investigations. If anyone discovers the shell companies, we'll claim they were legitimate humanitarian contractors that simply went out of business." Paul Jr., "I've already prepared documentation showing fake humanitarian activities. We have receipts for food deliveries that never happened, housing construction that was never built, and medical supplies that were never purchased." Nancy, excellent. The important thing is maintaining our cover story, that we were genuinely trying to help Ukraine. Even if they prove the money was stolen, we can claim it was mismanagement rather than intentional theft. The recording revealed their consciousness of guilt. "Remember, Paul, we're not just stealing money. We're stealing money from war refugees. If this gets exposed, we'll be seen as monsters who took food from starving children to buy luxury real estate." Boebert then displayed evidence of the real-world impact of the Pelosi family's theft, while your family was stealing millions from aid funds. "Madam Speaker, actual Ukrainian refugees were suffering from lack of resources. Let me show you what your theft cost real people." The screen showed photographs and documentation from Ukrainian refugee camps. This is a refugee camp in Poland where 15,000 Ukrainian families are living in substandard conditions because the housing construction your son's company was supposed to provide never happened. The $3.7 million meant for their housing is sitting in your son's Swiss bank account. Another slide showed medical documentation. These are medical records from Ukrainian children who died from preventable diseases because the medical supplies your family's companies were supposed to deliver never arrived. The $4.2 million meant for their medicine was diverted to your family's investment accounts. The personal impact was devastating. This is Maria Kovalenko, a 34-year-old Ukrainian mother whose 8-year-old daughter died from pneumonia in a Polish refugee camp. The antibiotics that could have saved her daughter's life were supposed to be purchased with money that your family stole for luxury real estate investments. Boebert's voice rose with righteous fury. While this child was dying because she couldn't get $15 worth of antibiotics, your family was using stolen aid money to buy a $12 million mansion in Napa Valley. You literally took medicine from dying children to finance your luxury lifestyle. The corruption went beyond personal enrichment to constitutional crisis. Madam Speaker, you didn't just steal from Ukrainian refugees. You violated your oath of office, corrupted the legislative process, and turned the Speaker's office into a criminal enterprise. Boebert displayed evidence of how Pelosi had abused her official powers. These records show that you used your position as Speaker to steer Ukraine aid contracts to your family's shell companies. You manipulated committee procedures, influenced agency decisions, and coordinated with foreign energy companies to maximize your family's profits. The constitutional implications were staggering. You turned the Speaker's office into a money laundering operation, selling legislative favors to foreign companies while stealing humanitarian aid meant for war refugees. You didn't just violate federal law. You betrayed the constitutional principle that public officials serve the people, not their own financial interests. Politically motivated. Boebert's voice cut through the protest like a sword. Madam Speaker, we have your banking records, your email communications, your recorded phone calls, and documented evidence of $23 million in stolen aid money. This isn't politics. This is documented criminal theft of humanitarian aid. She displayed a final comprehensive chart showing the full scope of the theft. $23 million stolen from Ukrainian refugee aid. $47 million in total bribes from Ukrainian energy companies over 10 years. Shell companies in 17 different countries. Offshore accounts in Switzerland, Cyprus, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands. Boebert looked directly into the cameras, speaking to the entire nation. Every American needs to understand what we've exposed here today. The Speaker of the House operated a criminal enterprise that stole money from war refugees while selling our foreign policy to the highest bidder. The chamber erupted as security moved to escort the completely broken Pelosi out, but Boebert's final words rose above the chaos. Nancy Pelosi, you didn't just betray your oath of office. You betrayed every American who trusted you to use their tax dollars to help suffering refugees. Your corruption ends today. As the financial evidence continued to display on every screen in the chamber, one thing was absolutely clear. Lauren Boebert had just exposed the Speaker of the House as the head of a money laundering operation that stole humanitarian aid from war refugees. The fearless woman from Colorado had proven that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law in America, not even the third most powerful person in government. She had shown that with courage, evidence, and unwavering commitment to justice, even the most protected political criminals can be brought down. Democracy had triumphed, justice had prevailed, and the American people finally knew the truth about who had been stealing their money while claiming to help war refugees.